everybody to please silence your cell phone at this time. I'd also like to remind you next week will be our final lecture in the series. Our current Mellon Fellow, Wendy Sepinen, will be giving a talk titled Death and Devotion, Sculpture in 16th Century Spain. So that should lure you back in for next week. Everybody loves a little death and devotion. This morning, we are circling back to the person who started our lecture series and did our first introduction, our curator here at the Meadows Museum, Amanda Dotseth. And Amanda has also been, of course, instrumental in developing this program, so let's all thank Amanda for that. I have introduced her recently, so I will not go into all of her details this morning, but I would just remind you all, she is a medieval Spanish art scholar, I should say, and she received her PhD from the Courtauld Institute in 2015. Amanda first served with us as the assistant curator here at the Meadows from 2007 to 2010, and she returned to us as a Mellon Fellow in 2016, and then this past year in September took up her position as curator in September. So we're delighted to have her back and working with us, and she is working on a number of projects, acquisitions, and other things here at the Meadows all the time, right, Amanda? Today she will be speaking on angels in the architecture, sacred space, and its adornments. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amanda Dotseth.
Hello, and thank you for coming. I was very grateful for those of you who were here last week for Abby Stockel's lecture on Islamic architecture in Spain, because most of the buildings we looked at, if you recall, were actually secular structures. We didn't look at a whole lot of mosques. So today we will be looking at sacred space, exclusively, in fact. And although admittedly sometimes the lines are a bit blurred between sacred space and secular space in terms of who uses it and how and why. So where do we begin? We begin with different kinds of buildings. We're going to look at a couple of different kinds of buildings today. I have the Jewish up there still. I apologize. I'm sorry. We're not going to be looking at synagogues. But in terms of Christian buildings, we're going to be looking at pilgrimage churches, cathedrals. Sometimes those are one and the same, and also monastic buildings as well. And the reason I point this out is because the way these buildings functioned and the way they're built is partly dependent upon the way they were used and who could use them and who had access. Abby spoke very well about at Medinat al-Zahra, if you remember, and levels of access and how people could get to ultimately the Caliph. And in this case, we're dealing with who had access to different kinds of spaces. So where do we begin? We begin in the northern part of the peninsula, in the northern part here of the Christian kingdoms. I, in the first lecture, spoke a little bit about Leon as the capital of what would eventually call itself an empire. And when are we? We're in the late 11th and early 12th century. And this is a really fascinating moment in not just the history of Spain, but the art history of Spain, because there's a huge building boom. We're not entirely sure why, but I will discuss some of the reasons why that might have happened. And the building boom takes the form of masonry, right? So this means we're not building in a more ephemeral material that doesn't survive. We're not building in wood, we're not building in stucco, we're building with masonry. And by masonry, I mean these wonderful blocks of stone. I'm showing you two images from the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, which is built using a local granite. It's this kind of dark, gray, gritty, very hard to carve, by the way. And we call this ashlar masonry, which just means we have these wonderful even rows of even blocks, right? Emphasized with these painted lines to make it look even better. The walls would have initially been covered with stucco and masonry lines would have been painted over the top. So why is this at the turn of the 12th century that there's this impulse to contain space with stone? And I'll just mention, this question hasn't been fully answered, and it's the subject of a project that I'm a part of, spearheaded by the Spanish National Research Council and funded by a Marie Curie grant, which is called Petrifying Wealth. I love the title. This idea of taking the wealth and turning it into stone and stone architecture. When I say building boom, what do I mean? I really do mean a lot of masonry architecture here. I'm just showing you one province in the north of Spain, Palencia. The pilgrimage road, which I'll be talking about in a minute, runs through, where are we here? Right through the middle of the province. It's kind of long and skinny. But all of these little buildings are Romanesque architecture. They're little Romanesque buildings. I always joke that you can't spit in Palencia without hitting something Romanesque, and this is the case. All the way even up here, this is a very difficult mountainous terrain up there. There's little Romanesque buildings all through there. So get ye to Valencia, rent a car, and drive around, because if you like Romanesque, this is the place for you. But I just wanted to give you a sense of what I meant by building boom and this amazing quantity of Romanesque buildings. And most scholars in the US, I'll just point out, who work on Romanesque architecture, work on France, right? And I'll just give you a quick personal anecdote, which is when I was applying for PhD programs and I wanted to work on a building we'll see in a minute called San Martín de Fromista, a Romanesque building in Palencia. It's on this map here somewhere around here. Anyways, I went to a certain professor at the IFA, at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and I told him I wanted to work on Romanesque architecture in Spain. And he said, well, why would you do that? They're just copying the French. It's when I decided the IFA wasn't for me and came to SMU and did an MA with Pamela Patton instead. But so my point is there is a ton of survival and very good things. I show you on the right, this is a late Romanesque church in kind of middle of nowhere Palencia. And what this building in masonry opened up for artists and for patrons was the possibility of expressing ideas in sculpture. So we're going to look at a lot of Romanesque sculpture. We're going to do this through the lens of two phenomena that were key to the development of economic, social, and art history at this time, at the turn of the 12th century. And one is pilgrimage, which we'll talk about here in a second. And pilgrimage, I'm specifically talking about the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain. And then conquest, and we'll talk about conquest as well. I did put the word conquest here, not reconquest. And whether it's conquest or reconquest, or the reconquista, as we've talked about at various points throughout this lecture series, really, if we put that prefix on of really depends on who you ask and when you ask them. So we'll get to that a little bit later on. So first, let's talk about pilgrimage. I love this map because it shows not just the so-called Camino Frances, this road through France to northwestern Spain, but it also shows a lot of the other roads. Really, the pilgrimage to anywhere, and of course the three major pilgrimages in medieval Christendom were to Rome, to the Holy Land, and to Santiago de Compostela, right? Which we'll talk about why that is in a minute. But really, pilgrimage is about wherever you come from, getting from wherever you are to the relics, right? So, if you're coming from Plymouth in England, you could take the boat. In fact, that actually sounds perhaps a lot better than crossing the channel and coming all the way down through France. But you'll see all of these points. A lot of these have major Romanesque buildings on them, like Moissac, if any of you have traveled in southern France, and then, of course, along this road as well. And then they show, of course, the pilgrimage to Rome as well. So here is a zoomed-in version focusing on the so-called Camino Frances, and it did have the majority of pilgrims. People could come from the south on the so-called Silver Road, the Camino de la Plata, which would come up here, but this is really the kind of main artery. part of the reason why this particular road is so significant is that it was so-called strada publica. It was a public way. So it attracted all kinds of different people, not just pilgrims, but merchants, crusaders, colonists, and even masons. So we have evidence of people moving along this road, and not necessarily like the so-called river that flows in one direction, but in all different directions. Industry was created by, then as now, by the pilgrimage, and it had to be accommodated. This led to, again, we were talking about a building boom, not just churches, which is what I showed you, but also you have to accommodate pilgrims. So there's pilgrims' hospitals, there's hostels, there's other kinds of infrastructure like bridges, right? So this spurs a whole building campaign and stimulates the economy of this area. Serafín Moralejo, the late and great historian of Romanesque Spain, said, "Pilgrimage cultivated an audience, a clientele, and a sphere of powerful resonance." I love the way that works because it implies a sort of vibration from the pilgrimage road outward of influence over the area. So this is where we left in my first lecture. This is Santiago de Compostela, so the ultimate goal of the pilgrimage through northern Spain. And so I'm showing here on the left the cathedral, the great cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. What you see is mostly Baroque, so much later facade that was put on, but we'll look at the good stuff. We'll look at the Romanesque bits in a minute. And then, of course, here on the right is the shrine of St. James. So we have the body of the apostle, the body of the saint and his relics contained within treasure, contained within this precious material that is then itself contained within a really important monument that would have required resources to build. So we have this wonderful, tantalizing story here, the tale of a stone boat and two Diegos. The stone boat comes from the story of Saint James the Apostle. This is Saint James the Greater, who was believed to have evangelized Spain. In other words, he's who came and converted the native people there from whatever pagan faith they were following to Christianity. He evangelized Spain before he returned to the Holy Land, where he was martyred by beheading. So sometimes you'll see images of St. James's martyrdom where he's beheaded as ever. His remains were miraculously transported on an oarless boat to Finisterre, which is in the extreme northwest of Spain. It's at the westernmost edge of the Iberian Peninsula, and that's why it's Finisterre means end of the earth, right? So it's this idea that it's way out there. His remains, so now we're fast forwarding from James's story of his oarless stone boat that miraculously made it from the Holy Land to the northwestern corner of Spain, to the 9th century when we have a hermit called Pelayo who discovers the remains of St. James with a miracle. Right? The miracle is a star shown, right? This might remind any of you who know the story of the Nativity and the birth of Christ. The three wise men are led by a star. This hermit Pelayo was also guided by a star, and that's where Santiago de Compostela gets its name. Santiago, St. James, Compostela is like field of stars. So just because a hermit finds the remains doesn't mean anything necessarily. This idea had to be taken up, believed. The story had to be believed and publicized. And this is where kings come into play. So we have a couple of Alfonsos in Asturias, these Christian kings up in the north, who recognize that this miracle is a true one and that these remains are actually James's, and support the construction of a church, right? So this is long before the building we're looking at on the screen, that this cult, this belief that these are the remains of the Apostle St. James is being supported. And it's being supported in the form of the construction of architecture, right? So now the two Diegos. So first we have Diego Peláez, who is the Bishop of Santiago in the late 11th century. So now we're right in that moment where I was talking about, I mean, there are so many things in Spain that happened in the last decades of the 11th century, right when this sort of building boom is happening. And he gets rid of whatever the Alfonsos have done on the site, and around 1075 begins construction on the cathedral we see today, the Romanesque bits. And what I'm showing you is an aerial view, because I think it's very useful to be able to get a sense with the ground plan here of the shape of the building, right? Which I hope the symbolism of which is not lost on you, right? It's very self-consciously in the shape of a cross. It is, as all Christian churches are, oriented, which simply means that the holiest part of the building, the apse, the altar, is facing east. So it's really nice if you're in a cathedral city. You can always figure out where you are, because if you can find a church, you can point yourself in the right direction. So here we are facing east. And this is what Diego's doing that's so important, is he's really putting all of his resources and the power behind these relics, and these being authentic relics and this cult, and promoting pilgrimage to his site. This is important because Toledo was conquered by Alfonso VI in 1085. Toledo had historically been the most important holy center in Spain since the Visigoths, which, if you were at my first lecture, we talked about Toledo and it's important for the Visigoths. But now you kind of have a rival center, right? You have a rival. Who's the most important? Who's the most important means a lot, because it includes things like tax exemption, for example, and other sort of rights and privileges, and who can attract pilgrims. So Diego Peláez is defending his site as the most important in Christian Spain, and he's doing that in part by building a building. Our second Diego is Diego Ramirez, who was also a bishop of Santiago de Compostela. In fact, he became an archbishop. And I love this quote from Barbara Al-Hajj, who wrote about Santiago in the time of Diego Ramirez, this great bishop who continued work on the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. And she said, a successful cult that may be construed had to be constructed, right? You couldn't just say, oh, we've got some relics, you know? You had to promote it. So there's something to be said for marketing a miracle, right? You've got to get the word out there. And you get the word out there by publishing and by circulating information across Europe. So we had Diego Peláez, who started construction on the East End. Most Christian churches are built from east to west, right? So he starts that East End in 1075, and then we have our second Diego Ramirez, who continues work westward until we get to what we see on the screen here, which is the wonderful Pórtico de la Gloria. So this is to just contextualize Santiago a little bit. Here, Santiago is in the bottom, but the function of these churches as the institution of the pilgrimage gained traction, not only to Rome, but to Santiago. Architecture had to keep up. And so we're back to, when you look at a building for the first time, you can ask yourself, what is this building doing? What is it meant to do? This building, the one we're standing in, was meant to display art and to keep it safe, but also to make it accessible, right? And so there's certain things about our architecture that do that maybe better or worse, depending on when we're in a grumpy mood or not. But these buildings were meant to be accessible. They were meant to be public. And so we're looking at a number of buildings from the south of France all the way to Santiago de Compostela. You'll notice they all have this cruciform shape. Again, it's a symbolic of the instrument of Christ's martyrdom, right, of Christ's death. But they have these wonderful aisles running around them. You know, we have the altar here, and then this wonderful curved apse that faces east. And this area around it is actually called an ambulatory, right? Like the English word to amble. So they're actually meant for people to walk through them, for people to process through them, not only to the altar, but for all these little, see these little nubby things here? Those are all little side chapels that would have had their own altars with their own relics. So there's a kind of mini pilgrimage within each building that's a part of your larger pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, where you enter and you process, you walk through, you venerate the various different relics, and then you can exit. And in some cases, at Santiago, for example, these transept doors were also entrances and exits. So, but they were built to accommodate people. I don't know why I put that there, but, oh. Okay, so as I said, the east end here was begun around 1075. They progressed westward until about 1130. So just to give you a sense of how long these buildings took to build, to cut stone, to fell trees for scaffolding, to get all of these resources and materials. You needed livestock, you needed people, you needed all of these things to build a church. And I wanted to show you this because our image of Santiago is so characterized by that Baroque facade. That's these towers, all of these towers, which were added much later, right? But the Romanesque, what it might have looked like, this is a hypothetical reconstruction of what it might have looked like after Diego Ramirez got to the west facade in the 1130s. Very different. I mean, you still have these imposing towers and whatnot, but it's a very different aspect. And Santiago, again, these are the dates, so I just want to give you a sense of how long these things took to build. But it is a kind of classic example of Romanesque architecture. And what I say when I mean that is these wonderful rounded arches. Those of you familiar with Gothic buildings may think of a pointed arch. This is before that. Romanesque was called Romanesque because it was thought to refer back to Roman architecture, right? It was kind of seen as a recuperation of the forms of Roman architecture. So again, there's a kind of nostalgia there. There's a kind of antiquity as authority, again, which we mentioned in the first lecture. And then these wonderful barrel vaults, right? So we have a ceiling, a vaulted ceiling made of stone. That's all stone. There's no wood there, which is great because it's fire resistant, right? But it's also incredibly labor intensive and expensive to cut all this really, really hard granite and get these huge piers into the ground, this gallery up at the second level here, which had only privileged access then as now. Not everybody gets to go up into the gallery. And then these wonderful barrel vaults. On the subject of construction, part of the reason we know about that early period of construction around 1075 at the east end of Santiago de Compostela are these goofy things called mason's marks, which are the evidence we have of the people who built this building. There's two kinds of mason's mark. One is called a banker's mark. The other is a placement mark. What I love about this image, why I chose it, is it has both. So the idea is when a mason cuts a stone, he wants to get paid for it, right? And so he would put his mark on that stone. And then at the end of the day, you could count up how many Bob, cut, and you could pay him accordingly. The other marks, so on this arch, for example, you can see there's these other marks. They tell you which stone in the arch goes where, because each of these is bespoke, right? Each of these is custom cut to fit in its appropriate place up until you get to the keystone here in the center that holds it all together, right? So this is how we know so much about the construction history of these churches. This is partly the result of this building boom I was talking about. Because if you were just building a small church with a few masons, you wouldn't need the kind of organized labor that requires masons to mark their stones. These kinds of marks are evidence of a very complex organized labor system at Santiago. We'll see them in other buildings as well, but I just love the ones here because they're so clearly visible. And if you go to Santiago, you can see them now as well. I'm also was one of the people who cataloged all the marks at at Santiago, so they're very much ingrained in my mind. I think I was dreaming about, you know, triangle guy for weeks, but anyways, yeah. So from the east end, now we're moving into the wonderful sculpted west facade. This is the Portico de la Gloria, which, because it has that Baroque facade in front of it now, it's incredibly difficult to photograph, I'm afraid. But it is attributed, we actually have a name for this, to a sculptor called the Master Matteo, who is documented as having been paid for the work on this part of the building. This is where pilgrims would have entered. It used to be exposed to the outside. Now you'd go through the Baroque facade and then enter through this space. But I show it to you because, so this is actually a little bit later. So we have Diego Ramirez, who by 1130 or so gets to the west facade. And then towards the end of the 12th century, 1168 to 88, we have Master Matteo creating these wonderful sculptures. It depicts Christ in majesty here in the center. So this is your redemption, right? Why do you go on pilgrimage? For penance, because you're a sinner, right? To ask for absolution for your sins. This is how you get it, right? Christ is being depicted here to remind the pilgrims that it is only through him that you're forgiven, right? So around him, and this is where we get to the angels in the architecture, around him we have these wonderful angels, and they're all, if you can see, holding the instruments of his passion. So maybe the easiest one to see here, we have this little angel, she's holding the nails. And the nails are important because, although you can't see it, I'll show you a better image in a minute, Christ is showing his wounds to the viewer, right? He has his hands up, and the stigmata from where he was nailed to the cross are visible. Not so visible today, though, are they? So here's a little better image, and I hope you can see it a little better here. But my point is, we are used to these spaces being somber, dark. This was entirely covered with paint originally. So I brought you, if I can get it, if I can find it.
Con el agua de la lluvia escurriendo por las columnas y los restos de color cayendo al suelo día tras día. Así estaba el Pórtico de la Gloria hace 10 años. Y así está hoy. Las figuras esculpidas por el maestro Matteo hace 8 siglos y medio han recuperado su expresividad y sus rojos, dorados y azules originales. Los restauradores han sacado a la luz hasta 3 capas de policromía.
Es una obra tan innovadora, de una calidad que nos emocionaba al equipo cada día, y cada día descubríamos nuevas cosas. Pues la calidad de la talla, los detalles, la minuciosidad de los pliegues, de los tocados, de los peinados.
Han sido necesarias 50.000 horas de trabajo de 12 restauradores, algunos extranjeros, asesorados por químicos, biólogos, geólogos y con técnicas de última generación.
20 años tardó el maestro Matteo en completar su obra cumbre y 10 años ha tardado esta profunda restauración que le ha devuelto la gloria al pórtico.
La Fundación Barrié, mecenas del proyecto, ha invertido más de 6 millones de euros.
Aquí ha habido un antes y un después en lo que significa la investigación científica en procesos de restauración de monumentos de esta magnitud y esta naturaleza.
La inauguración oficial será el lunes con la presencia de la reina Sofía, pero esta joya del románico no abrirá al público hasta que no finalicen las obras de la fachada do Obradoiro, aproximadamente dentro de un mes.
This really is meant to be experienced three-dimensionally. So having seen that, that's what it looks like today. Here's a reconstruction. All these yellow bits are gold, right? But even from here, you can see Christ's stigmata now, right? So you can get a sense of how important the polychromy really was to the sculpture, because color is what animates all of these figures. When I saw this, I about died, by the way, because I just, imagining the Portico de la Gloria looking like this is just insane. But it's not all angels in the architecture. And so I considered calling this lecture Sin in the Sanctuary. That was a little bit tempting as well. But I have an article I'm working on called Sin in the Sanctuary, so I decided on the Paul Simon reference. Anyway, so just so you don't think it's all about angels, I brought these two beautiful fragments of sculpture. They're from an archivolt, so they would have been around a doorway, from Santiago de Compostela. They're in their museum now. And I mean, I gave away what they're depicting, but this is depicting the sin of lust, right? Can everyone see what's going on here? It's a bit hairy. So we'll see, there's a couple sins that medieval Christians and medieval Spain were particularly upset about, and one of them was lust. And part of the reason for this is there's major church reform going on at the time that was trying to crack down on celibacy or the lack thereof in the clergy, right? This was a real problem. So sometimes you'll actually get these figures are tonsured so that we know, that they were actually part of the clergy that are being lusty. I don't think this guy's tonsured, I can't remember. But anyways, what we have here is this guy who's got his bits here. They've been kind of chipped off, probably deliberately at a later time. And then we have this demon hanging on to them. In case you needed, any evidence of like what would happen to you if you succumbed to lust. I mean, this is not very pleasant. And then, the woman's fate is no better. And this is a classic sort of signifier of lust. We have the woman here with the snake entwined around her legs and biting at her breasts. It is not subtle. And then, and we may have two sins in one here, this demon is biting her tongue. Do you see how he's pulling her tongue out and biting it? Perhaps for blasphemy. So we get this sense of, you have this wonderful image in the Portico de la Gloria of how you were saved, but this is what you're being saved from, right? So it's not all cathedrals on the pilgrimage, and so I wanted to show you some of the other buildings that were key to the pilgrim's experience. And one of them is San Martín de Fromista. It's in the province of Palencia, which is the province I showed you with all the Romanesque churches earlier. This church, San Martín de Fromista, was actually not a parish church, not a cathedral, it was a monastic church. So it formed part of a Benedictine monastery. Of course, you can't tell that now because it's sitting there by itself, kind of jewel-like. And so it doesn't have any of the other buildings around it that would have initially been there. But unlike other monastic buildings that we'll look at in a minute, because it was on the pilgrimage road, it did have to be accessed in the way that the big pilgrimage churches I showed you with the cruciform shapes would have been accessed. People would have stopped here to venerate the relics of St. Martin of Tours. Those of you who know our collection know that we have that wonderful painting on loan from the MFA Boston upstairs, I think by Martin Bernat, of St. Martin of Tours, same saint. So his relics were here at Fromista, and pilgrims could venerate them. This church, the monastery, I should say, the monastery was founded around 1066 by a queen, by Doña Mayor. But this building dated to much later, to probably around 1118 in the early 12th century. So we have evidence of the fact that this monastic community was was active from the end of the 11th century, but probably partly due to pilgrims had enough money to make their church look a lot better than it did before. And this is the perfect example of that. And again, you'll see what we saw in Santiago, some of these classic characteristics of Romanesque architecture, like round arches. And I'll show you the vaults here in a minute. I should say what you're looking at Fromista is also, I put a little asterisk here. I don't know if any of you follow baseball, but right, if the baseball player's record is maybe a bit squiffy, they put a little asterisk by it. Fromista's got an asterisk by it because it was heavily restored in the early 20th century. So a lot of what you're looking at is actually what 20th century restorer thought a Romanesque church should look like. It's like those wonderful gargoyles at Notre Dame. They're all 19th century. I hope that didn't break anyone's heart. But anyways, here's what it looked like before. So you get a sense when I say a monastic church, the church is here, but it's got all this stuff This is a model showing what it looked like before the 20th century restoration. All this stuff to accommodate the monks. The monks had to live there, right? So there would have been initially a cloister, a garden, all of these things. And this is what the building looked like before the early 20th century restorer got to it and made it this little perfect Romanesque jewel. So again, but whether 20th century or 12th, we have these wonderful characteristics of Romanesque architecture. So these are all parts of the things that were key to that building boom in the 12th century, right? And it's not just architectural features like those round arches and archivolts and all that, but it's also sculpture. So I'm going to show you some wonderful, oh, well, first interior here. So we have this wonderful dome, right, over the transept with these, and then these again, these stone vaults. So these beautiful barrel vaults. And then this stuff right here is called billet molding. It's like it runs along a string course here and looks kind of like checkers. In Spanish, it's called like checked. But then we also have sculpture. So I brought you two wonderful sculpted capitals from Fromista that I think show some of the, again, sins that you had to redeem yourself for, that you had to pray for when you visited these sites. First, on the left, we have original sin. This is the source of all sin, and that is Mary, what am I saying? She's not sinner. Eve, that is like the worst slip up ever. I'm gonna be damned. It's Eve, Adam and Eve. Here she is, and I mean, I love how active they made Eve in this, the artist, because she's the one plucking the apple and simultaneously hiding her shame. It is from this act that we, in Christian theology, we are all born into sin. And here's Adam, and then we have these little goofy guys. Again, here's a guy pulling his tongue. Here's a guy being eaten by someone else. These are kind of fanciful. They could represent, again, sins of blasphemy or pride, but they're also just kind of, I think there's a humor in this as well. Some of these simply aren't explained. So this is a biblical story, but on the right, I'm showing you another capital, which is telling a popular tale. Does anyone know what it is, or does anyone have a guess? This is a bird. This is a fox. This is a round thing. If I tell you, I'll give it away. It's Aesop's fable of the crow and the fox. Isn't that great? So we have does everyone know this story? It's a great story, but it's a story of pride. So the idea is the crow had a piece of cheese in his mouth, and he didn't want to give it up to the fox, but the fox is very cunning, and so he said to the crow, well, I want to hear your beautiful voice and hear you sing. So he flattered the crow, and the crow started singing and dropped the cheese right into the fox's mouth. So within the church, within the sacred space of the building, we have two very different kinds of lessons on sin. On original sin, which none of us can do anything about, and also the sin of pride. On the exterior of the building, we have these wonderful little corbel sculptures, and I love this shot because you can see what the whole block looks like here. They're under the eaves, under this wonderful billet molding, and you can see it's a single block that's carved to hold up the eave and then have this little sculpture. And what we get, most of those Romanesque churches I showed you in Palencia have sculpture like this, some of which we can explain, some of it we really can't. Animal faces, this guy again his little head's being eaten by super fang guy here, colmillos. We have a donkey playing a harp. Some of these we can explain and some of these we can't. Here are some of the ones we can explain. They're contortionists in a lot of cases, and we can talk about the world topsy-turvy, the world upside down. This may represent the sin of pride. Again, pride thought to reside in the head, so an animal eating the head. But then I guess I probably don't have to tell you what sin this on the right is pointing out. Very saucy and very equal opportunity in terms of the representation of genitalia. It's not just men here, guys. So And I believe one of these figures, if you get up close and look, is tonsured. So again, there's this idea that it's not just about celibacy or lust among the laity, but also among the clergy and among monks themselves. We have records of complaints and litigation surrounding the children of clergy members, the children of monks. So we know they weren't sticking to the celibacy thing. So the fact that these documents manifest themselves in sculpture is, yeah, anyway. She's getting it from the snake, yeah. So actually, this, right here, so the snake is entwined around the tree, right? And then the apple, it's in the snake's mouth, and she's taking it from his mouth. And meanwhile, hiding her shame. So they're kind of conflating two moments in the story here, the taking of the apple and then also what would ultimately happen after. We're getting some foreshadowing. When Adam and Eve are cast out of the Garden of Eden, they no longer are comfortable being naked, essentially, and so they cover their shame. And so this is a very typical way it's represented in art. Adam is already covering his shame as well, his genitalia. So I just wanted to show you another kind of more oblique reference to lust. This is a capital, this is somewhere in France, I think this one's in San Isidoro in Leon, so another pilgrimage church that I talked about in the first lecture. And these are mermaids with split tails, again, thought to reference lust. They're very lusty ladies. They have exposed breasts, and there's this idea of separating the legs to such an extent that they flip up over her sides. And I couldn't help but point out where this went. And this is the original Starbucks logo, who I guess they thought was a little too saucy because they censored her down here. But it's right out of Romanesque art. So back to monastic architecture. We are now extra Camino. We're off the Camino, not by far. But I wanted to point out, it's not all about the pilgrimage, and not everybody followed the pilgrimage in a perfect linear path. There were important relics off the Camino, so at San Millán de la Cogolla, for example, and at Santo Domingo de Silos. So you could take an excursion off the route to venerate particular relics. Silos was a particularly important excursion off the route. And there's a wonderful story I should tell you of a particular pilgrim who was crippled, and he was doing the pilgrimage to be cured. And I think he made it as far, he made it to here, Carrión de los Condes, and he prayed to the relics of San Zoilo, which is who the relics at Carrión de los Condes were. So he gets this far, which, a little over halfway, let's say, and he's miraculously cured by San Zoilo. So he picks his stuff up and turns around and goes back to France. So you don't have to go all the way, I guess is my point. And there's a lot of records of people being cured on their excursion to Santo Domingo as well. So here we are at Santo Domingo de Silos. Has anyone actually been there? I know you have, Carmen, but yes. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, as many monasteries are, because they were trying to retreat from the world. But I wanted to show you, this is more like what a place like Fromista would have looked like before all those exterior structures were torn down. This, I hope you notice, looks very different than some of the other churches we're looking at that are isolated, that are parish churches or cathedrals that are in cities, right? This had to be a self-sustaining kind of unit. Yes, they very often had servants. This is a Benedictine monastery, I should say. But there's all these other areas around, places for them to sleep, places for them to eat, in the refectory, for example, places for business to be done in the I just forgot the name in English, chapter house. Woo! I'm like in the sala capitular, everybody, of course. Of course, a scriptorium and a bibliography. See, now I'm in too many languages. Library. And if any of you have read Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, that gives you a really good snapshot of kind of life in a Benedictine monastery, a fairly accurate one. I kind of wish they spent more time in the cloister, but you'll get the idea. But of course, there's also a church a part of that as well. Most of these buildings at Silos the Romanesque buildings don't survive, but I will show you the cloister here in a minute. So just a quick note on the rule of St. Benedict, and again, this is important because this function of monks living in this space, living, cooking, growing things, is important to what the architecture looks like. This is actually up at Silos, so you can see what a day in the life of a Benedictine monk at Silos is like. This is the little sleepy time here, but pretty much all this other time, they're either working or praying. And I love this line from St. Benedict himself, the founder of the rule, which is, idleness is the enemy of the soul. So this idea that they're always active, but they're active in prayer. And there's a lot of it. And then, of course, I just threw up this image of St. Benedict from our collection, from the Parival painting. So this is the Romanesque bit of Silos that is best known. That is what the monastery is known for today. The site, we know, there's evidence that it was in use since Visigothic times. There's documentary and actually, I think, archaeological evidence as well. But it's not until the late 11th century, again, this exact moment of all of this building boom when everything's happening, that there's this wonderful abbot, Domingo, or Dominic. He died in 1073 and was canonized as a saint in 1076. So it only took 3 years. You get canonized partly because your remains or you yourself performed miracles. And so Domingo very early on is the object of an active cult and of venerations by pilgrims. And there's a number of miracles associated with him. A little bit later, so around 1100, is when we have this cloister being built. The cloister is kind of the heart, in some ways, of the monastery. It was a multi-use space. All these other things emanate from the cloister. You would pray in the cloister. You might write in the cloister, read in the cloister. There's natural light in there, which is very important. And so it's this really, really important space within the monastery. And there's also rituals that take place in the space. And so you can see certain columns look a little bit different. And the idea is that those columns signaled at what part in your procession around it you started a certain part of the liturgy. The sculpture of these capitals it's griffins, these very deeply carved basket weave, which to me looks a little bit like the ivory carving we've seen, or even it's been compared to manuscript illuminations. There's not historiated capitals per se, historiated meaning that they tell a story, like a biblical story. But dating to slightly later, around the mid-12th century, we have this amazing pier sculpture. Each of the piers, so each of the 4 corners of this cloister, are decorated with these amazing relief sculptures, and I have some wonderful examples here. They all depict moments after the resurrection, so post-passion. This is Christ's life and that of the apostles and of Mary after he was resurrected, and then we have an ascension here. He was ascended into heaven. So we have the ascension and the Pentecost, which is what you see here, the ascension on the right, and all the little apostles, and you can just make out St. Peter here holding a key. So the apostles with their attributes. I think James is here somewhere depicted as a pilgrim. And then the Pentecost on the right, which tells the story of Mary, here in the sense, see her little head coming out, is Mary, and the Holy Spirit descends, and this is when all the apostles are blessed with the ability to speak different languages so they can go out and evangelize, right? So this is when, presumably, St. James would have been given the power to come speak to the Iberians and convert them to Christianity. But I just love this sculpture, and I brought a detail. These are clouds. Aren't those amazing? This is the hand of God in blessing descending from the clouds. And these lovely little chubby angels with their deeply incised hair here. And the idea is you're actually processing around this space. So they're joining you. These figures are huge, and they're processing. So you get this sense that you're a part of this holy congregation. This is another one of my favorite of the pier sculptures. Does anyone know what this depicts? This one's a little easier to guess, I would say, than the Pentecost. Yes, it's Doubting Thomas. It's pretty obvious, right? So we have the story of St. Thomas, who quite famously doubted that Christ had resurrected after being crucified. And he asked to touch Christ's wounds to be convinced, right? So this is an epiphany. This is a moment that confirms for Thomas, but also for the reader, for all Christians, that Christ did resurrect, right? This touching of the body. And that's what we have here. And the sculptor has actually, the figure, okay, his finger is a little broken, it is really quite old, but he's actually putting his finger into Christ's wound. And it's done in one of the most dynamic compositions, I think, in Romanesque architecture, right? You've just this strong, everybody's kind of inclining in a little bit, but Christ's arm is so emphatically diagonal, and his hair coming down here on his arm, and Thomas, whose name is on his halo here, shoving his finger into Christ's wound. It's actually, in a way, very serene, but also kind of violent, right? And then, of course, all these apostles, this is a very literate cloister, because we have inscriptions in all of the halos that identify, but then again, here you have Peter holding his key, so there's also attributes. Finally, this is the road to Emmaus. This is yet another pier sculpture. And I wanted to show you this because this is Christ, not St. James, but Christ in this story is depicted as a pilgrim. And so we know that by this time, by the 12th century, that image of the cockle shell was already associated with pilgrimage. So any of you who know the contemporary pilgrimage now and have seen those cockle shells, I'm wearing one today, actually, just for the occasion, that I bought in Santiago de Compostela. And this symbol of the pilgrimage being the cockle shell was actually a very early thing. Okay, so now we've had all kinds of post-passion redemption stories, but that's not all that was in the cloister, because of course, I also have to show you some sin. So here we go. Sin sometimes wasn't as explicitly depicted as it was in some of the images I showed you of people exposing themselves, but apes are extremely common in Romanesque sculpture, and the idea is that apes, and I do mean ape, not monkey. Monkeys have tails, apes don't. I was corrected at a conference for calling these monkeys. These are apes, and they were thought to ape mankind. So you'll see them in sculpture doing things that presumably they've seen a human do, right? In this case, this one, I'll show you this one on the left first. And the idea is sin isn't only depicted on the exterior of buildings, it's also on the interior. It's a message that monks themselves had to take to heart. Again, it's like that tonsured figure we saw exposing himself. So this is in the cloister. No one enters the cloister but the monks. This is a private space. This is not for pilgrims. This is, nowadays we can all go in, yay, but not when the monks are there. So these sculptures are speaking to a very specific audience. This is a wonderful ape, and you can see he's got these cords around him. And this symbolizes how he is chained and restrained by sin. You're not free, you are restrained. Otherwise, he's pretty tame. Less tame, this is a church, a smaller church that's very near to Santo Domingo de Silos. So here we have at Silos. This sculpture is right in the east end of the church, the holiest part of the building, right? Where the altar is, where the liturgy takes place, where the host is consecrated. This guy is sitting right there. This gal and this guy is sitting right there. And these are two apes who are also chained by their sin, but they're also representing lust very clearly. This female ape exposes herself, and then this male ape over here, it's hard to see, but this hand is actually on his phallus, and so the idea is that they're both actually masturbating. These are masturbating apes in the holiest part of the Romanesque church. Believe me, when I saw this, now, she hasn't been vandalized, but he has, oddly enough. So people with more puritanical sentiments came in later and dealt with these guys. But I just wanted to point out that this preaching against sin through images and through sculpture wasn't just for the laity, and it wasn't just on the exterior churches. You hear this narrative a lot, but here it is, right here in the cloister and right here in the sanctuary. So I just wanted to return, I'm not sure how I am on time. 10 minutes, okay. So I just wanted to return very briefly to the themes that I introduced in the first lecture. And they are conflict, convivencia, and everything in between, antiquity as authority, and reuse and recycle. And to return to those themes and to kind of segue into the next lecture you will have, where you will zoom forward in time to the 15th century, I wanted to just point out one particular piece of iconography related to what we're talking to today. This iconography that I'll tell you about is born of this idea of conquest, reconquest, or conquest and crusade. And I'm just showing you a map here of the time periods we've been talking about in the late 11th, early 12th century, where you see the pink bits, which include Compostela, and are the conquests of Fernando I, and then Alfonso VI, who we've talked about as well, pushes further south, and that's where he gets Toledo in 1085. We're zooming forward in time here, but I want you to see this kind of, the Christian kingdoms are like molasses dripping down the Iberian Peninsula here and keep pushing further and further into these Taifa kingdoms that Abby talked about, until finally, certainly by the 15th century, all that's left is Granada. But Granada, it's still a vassalage of the Christian kingdoms, but it is not technically conquered. Born of this centuries of fighting and conquest is a particular iconography called Santiago Matamoros, which means Santiago Moorslayer. Does anyone know about, you've probably heard of this, maybe, iconography. So in the 11th and 12th century, everything I showed you was St. James as an apostle and St. James as a pilgrim. So when does he become the Moorslayer? When does he become someone who acts in battle? And this is it. This is the classic image from Romanesque times of St. James as the pilgrim. Here he is with his cockle shell. So this is 12th century. Here on the right in the 14th. It's a very, very different conception of saintliness and what a saint is. And it's very key here that he's not just on horseback, sword drawn, in battle, actively in battle, but he's actually participated. And we know that because we have the severed heads of, in this case, very clearly armed and by their armor identified as Arabs in this image. And the illuminator's taken the time to paint the blood. This is a very kind of gory, active thing. But there's a big gap here between the 11th century and the 14th. So I'm just going to skip a few images here. Okay. So this is one of the earliest images of St. James on horseback. And this dates to a legend that came about in the 12th century that St. James interceded in battle on the behalf of Fernando I, a Christian king, when he was fighting Muslim armies, right? So this idea that he appears on horseback, they have this wonderful battle cry, they yell Santiago, and they win the battle. This is a model based on saints like St. George that appear in battle, and I just wanted to read very quickly. To describe the iconography, I think there's no one better than Cervantes, so I'll just read this very quickly. So this is Don Quixote. Don Quixote laughed and asked them to take off the neck's cloth. Underneath which was seen the image of the patron saint of the Spain seated on horseback, his sword stained with blood, trampling on Moors and treading heads underfoot. And on seeing Don Quixote exclaimed, "Aye, this is a knight, and of the squadrons of Christ. This one is called Don St. James the Moorslayer, one of the bravest saints and knights that the world ever had or heaven has now." So this is coming out of a legend that developed in the 12th century, that St. James participated in battle. But I wanted to point this out to you because this is in Santiago de Compostela, and I wanted to highlight that it shows St. James on horseback, but these people are hardly victims. They're praying. They're thankful to St. James. So I would like to argue that this is St. James the Knight, not St. James the Moorslayer. The Middle Ages gets a lot of bad, reputation for a lot of things. And I'm just saying that St. James the Moorslayer shouldn't be one of them. So here we can see it better. Again, interceding in battle, but not actively slaying, right? That is really a product of a later time period. And I'm showing you a 15th century panel painting from Segovia. And this is where I think we cross that line from St. James the Knight, St. James who appears in battle, and because you prayed to him, he helps you kind of metaphorically to win the battle, to him actually participating. And of course, this is important, and I'm showing you a 19th century recreation of Ferdinand and Isabella the Catholic capturing Granada. So again, this relates to the idea of the reconquest. The idea of it being a reconquest, I think, is as much an early modern or late medieval idea as it was a 12th century idea. So this idea that Granada was the last stronghold that Isabella and Ferdinand the Catholic in 1492 had to conquer. And of course, the battle cry at that battle was Santiago. And it is at that point that we get all of these gory images. And so I just wanted to show you one last thing to conclude, which is that these images are very controversial, as you might imagine. And so I'm just showing you this. This is a 16th century sculpture of St. James the Moorslayer. Yeah, those of you who read Spanish, this is a particularly snarky report, I will say. Because they're saying these energetic cannons at Santiago de Compostela have converted St. James the Moorslayer into St. James the Flower Slayer. And this is actually the case. Because this sculpture was so controversial, and I understand why, they've just planted some plants there to kind of hide it. So now it's a question of being censored, but what I wanted to say was this is not a medieval problem. This is an early modern problem, and really about that idea of antiquity as authority and saying that St. James interceded in battle in the Middle Ages. That became so important in the Renaissance and later, and even in the New World when St. James Moorslayer became St. James Indian Slayer. So this is a product of the early modern period that's using the Middle Ages and the antiquity of a legend of St. James to their own end. And that's all I've got. Any questions? Yes.
Where is that?
In Santiago Cathedral. Yeah. It's in the cathedral. So it's actually, it's in the, let me orient myself here. It's in the north transept. Last time I was there. And it's a sculpture, a devotional sculpture that you can light a candle to say a prayer for. So it's got, all the little electric candles in front of it. But yeah, this was. The legend or the sculpture, this one, is 16th century. Yeah. I mean, I looked very hard for images of St. James Moorslayer before the 14th century and didn't find him. So If someone finds one, do tell. Yeah?
Just a comment. At the Meadows Museum in Austin,
Yes.
the beautiful Peruvian painting of San James, the Inca slave.
Yes, yes. It's a fascinating translation, isn't it? Yeah. No, and I had gathered all these wonderful images, wonderful, they're not wonderful, they're actually really harrowing and disgusting and horrible, but I gathered a bunch of them to show you, and, but what's fascinating to me about it is that it's invoking a legend that supposedly happened in the 9th century as a sort of reason why this is acceptable, right? Or a reason why James would intercede, because he's been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. The fact that he didn't, probably, I mean, is a different story. Any other questions? Yeah.
Two things. The main altar at Santiago, as you know,
Yes.
displays the three aspects of St. James.
Yes.
And so you have, as apostle, as
Yep.
more slayer. And another thing that I heard, and I don't know if you know this, when the cast was made for the V&A
Uh-huh.
of the Portico Glory,
Mhm.
that was a time at which a lot of the paint was pulled.
So it's an interesting point. I was just at a conference at the V&A, in fact, where they talked about that, and it kind of depends on who you ask. I think it's impossible for it to not have pulled some of the polychromy off. Now, whether or not that polychromy was medieval is a different story. It might have been 19th or 18th century or 17th century. But it did supposedly pull some of the polychromy off. Other people you'll talk to will say that, they would use a non-water soluble material before putting the plaster on to help prevent it sticking and pulling. So some say it didn't actually damage the sculpture as much as had been previously thought. But I think it's obviously not going to do nothing to them. I mean, I wouldn't let someone take a plaster cast of one of my sculptures. So.
I'm trying to get around to the back of it, but you can't do that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anybody has, in regard to this aspect, has actually seen the back,
Of the cast? Or of the cast? Yes, so they were just restored, and they're completely reinstalling the plaster cast courts at the Victoria and Albert, and they've done a complete study on it. So watch this space, so that it's like being published as we speak. Yeah, so it's a fascinating period. I'm contributing to that volume, so it's very present in my mind right now. Any other questions? Yeah.
It must be an ongoing dilemma of restoration. Why is polychromy less important today than it would have been? In other words, why don't they restore it to the original? But then you have the passage of time and history. Also have to be preserved and respected.
Yeah,
It must really be hard to figure out.
it is, and it's
Put back and what's not to put back and when and how to put it back.
it's very actively being debated right now, and there are different schools of thought in the U.S., for example, versus in France. So there have been very high-profile restorations in France where they restored stucco and polychromy, and some people throw a fit, some people think it's great. One of the arguments against it is we don't know if we put something on the stone, we don't know what it'll do. So we don't know what it'll do over time. So for example, the lamb portal at San Isidoro de Leon in the 50s was coated with something that was meant to protect, it's sandstone, so it's quite soft, meant to protect it. And if you look at photos, black and white photos from the 70s versus now, it's night and day, because in the end, that stuff totally deteriorated the sculpture. So there is a debate that just because we think what we're putting on in terms of restoration of polychromy, what we think now in whatever year this is, 2019, I almost said 18, dear Lord, because we think it's safe, that doesn't mean, in 50, let alone 100 years it is. So that's one debate. The other debate is taste. People don't like it. We're not used to it.
The big thing is Chartres right now.
Yes, exactly.
The interior of Chartres has now been restored with its plaster.
Yep.
And its
This is Chartres is what I was talking about.
and
Yeah.
its paintings and all of that.
and that was done by a French restoration team. A number of American scholars threw a fit, signed a petition.
The English think it's horrible because they want everything as it was, dark and gray and dingy.
Well, it wasn't dark and gray and dingy. And so this is the question, how was it? Which was are we selecting?
It was before the restoration.
Right.
At that moment it was. And so they're trying to see how this church used to look when it was
Yes.
which it was not filled with light.
Yeah, there was a great story in Spain of I think it was a Romanesque fresco was discovered underneath a Baroque one. And they tore the Baroque one out to get to the Romanesque one. Now part of me is like, yay. But this is a problem, right? These are all of these things are part of the history of a monument. So I'm not sure what the answer is. I fall under the category of less is more because I'm afraid that by reapplying stucco, you're potentially damaging it. And, we can't change what past restorers did, but we can change what we do.